The year was 1943, and in the heavily fortified war room deep beneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler slammed his fist on the oak table with such force that his generals flinched. The Führer's face was contorted with rage. But beneath the fury there was something else, something his officers had rarely seen in their leader's eyes. Fear. He jabbed his finger at the intelligence report lying before him, the paper trembling in his hand. "These Australians," he hissed through clenched teeth, "are turning my best pilots into corpses. I want them avoided at all costs. Do you understand me? At all costs." The room fell into stunned silence. The man who had conquered most of Europe, who had sent millions to their deaths without hesitation, had just admitted defeat. Not to the British, not to the Americans, but to a group of sunburned pilots from the other side of the world who flew second-hand planes and called themselves the Desert Demons. This is the story of how a squadron of humble Australian airmen became so deadly, so absolutely terrifying in combat, that Hitler himself ordered the Luftwaffe to run away from them. And before we dive into this incredible tale, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story deserves to be heard around the world. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like Hollywood fiction, like some propaganda tale cooked up to boost morale during wartime. But I assure you, what you're about to hear is documented history, a chapter of World War II that has been criminally overlooked, buried beneath the more famous stories of Spitfires over Britain and Mustangs over Germany. The men of number 450 Squadron RAAF weren't born heroes. They weren't elite warriors selected from birth and trained in some secret facility. They were farmers, mechanics, clerks, and teachers from the Australian outback and coastal towns, young men who had never seen combat, most of whom had never even been in an airplane before the war. Yet within 2 years of their formation, they would accumulate a kill record so staggering, so disproportionate to their numbers, that German intelligence officers initially refused to believe the reports. Over 150 confirmed Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed. Not damaged, not driven away, destroyed. And among those weren't just ordinary pilots, these were aces, men with dozens of kills to their names, the cream of the German Air Force, veterans of the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. How did they do it? That's the question that haunted Hitler, that kept Luftwaffe commanders awake at night, and that we're going to answer right now. The story begins not in the glamorous air battles over Europe, but in the scorching, merciless deserts of North Africa in 1941. The situation was desperate. Rommel's Afrika Korps was pushing the Allies back across Libya and threatening Egypt. The Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to its empire, hung in the balance. The RAF was stretched impossibly thin, outgunned and outnumbered by Luftwaffe squadrons that had been honing their skills since the Spanish Civil War. Into this cauldron of fire and sand came the Australians. Number 450 Squadron was officially formed in February 1941, equipped with obsolete Kitty Hawk fighters, planes that the Americans didn't even want, machines that overheated in the desert sun and jammed with sand. The British officers who received them were, to put it mildly, unimpressed. One RAF group captain was overheard saying, "Great. Send us the colonials with their hand-me-down crates. What's next, boomerangs?" The prejudice was palpable, the dismissal complete. These weren't the polished graduates of prestigious academies. These were rough men with rough accents who seemed to treat military discipline as a suggestion rather than an order. But there was something those British officers didn't understand about Australians, something forged in the harsh landscape of their homeland. These men had grown up in a country that actively tried to kill you, where the sun could cook you alive, where snakes and spiders carried enough venom to drop a horse, where you learned from childhood that underestimating anything, even the smallest threat, could mean death. They had spent their lives reading the land, tracking prey across endless expanses, making split-second decisions in unforgiving environments, and most critically, they had inherited a culture that despised arrogance and valued results over rank. Their squadron leader, a man named Robert "Bobby" Gibbies, embodied this ethos perfectly. Gibbies was a farmer's son from Young, New South Wales, a town so small it barely appeared on maps. Before the war, he'd spent his days mustering sheep and fixing tractors, not dreaming of aerial glory. He was soft-spoken, almost shy, with none of the swagger you'd expect from a fighter pilot. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully, economically, as if language itself was a limited resource not to be wasted. His eyes, though, those pale blue eyes that had spent years scanning Australian horizons, they saw everything. Gibbies had a gift, an almost supernatural ability to read the sky, to sense where the enemy would be before they appeared. And he had something else too, an absolute unshakable calm under pressure that would become legendary. The squadron's first real test came in June 1941, over the besieged city of Tobruk. The Luftwaffe had been pounding the Allied positions mercilessly, flying with impunity, their Messerschmitt 109s and Junkers dive bombers operating as if they owned the sky. The German pilots were cocky, and why wouldn't they be? They had conquered Poland, humiliated France, fought the RAF to a standstill. These were the best trained pilots in the world, flying the most advanced fighters ever built. What could some colonial farmers possibly do against them? The answer came screaming out of the sun at 400 miles per hour. Gibbies led his flight of 4 Kitty Hawks straight into a formation of 12 Messerschmitts, an attack so audacious, so tactically insane, that the German pilots assumed it must be a diversion for a larger force. There was no larger force, just 4 Australians who had decided that 12-4 were acceptable odds. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 5 Messerschmitts were spiraling toward the desert floor in flames, and the remaining 7 were fleeing north as fast as their engines could carry them. The Australians hadn't lost a single aircraft, not one. Back at their base, the British liaison officer demanded a full debrief, certain that the Australians were exaggerating, engaging in typical colonial braggadocio. But the gun camera footage didn't lie, and neither did the wreckage scattered across 20 miles of desert. The officer, a man named Squadron Leader Reginald Mathers, examined the evidence with growing disbelief. This is impossible," he muttered, his upper-class accent dripping with condescension that barely masked his shock. "Messerschmitts are superior to Kitty Hawks in every measurable way. How did you—" Gibbies cut him off with that characteristic Australian directness that made British officers so uncomfortable. "They're better planes, yeah. Faster, better climb rate, better everything. But see, mate, they're not better pilots." The room went quiet. Mather's face flushed red. "I beg your pardon. The Luftwaffe pilots are the most experienced combat aviators in the world. They've been fighting since they started winning," Gibbies interrupted again, his voice still calm but with an edge now. "They're used to opponents who fight by the book, who follow the rules. We don't have a book, Squadron Leader. We just have the sky, and we've been reading it our whole lives." The tension in that moment was thick enough to cut with a knife. A clash not just of personalities but of entire worldviews. Mathers represented the old order, the belief in hierarchy, proper procedure. The notion that warfare was a gentleman's pursuit conducted according to established principles. Gibbies and his men represented something else entirely: pragmatism, adaptability, a willingness to throw out the rulebook if the rulebook wasn't working. And here's where the story gets truly fascinating, because Mathers wasn't just wrong about the Australians, he was wrong about everything. The Luftwaffe pilots were indeed experienced, but they had become predictable, their tactics calcified by success. They expected their enemies to engage in turning dogfights, to try matching the Messerschmitt's superior maneuverability. The Australians refused to play that game. Instead, they developed what would later be called boom and zoom tactics, diving from altitude using the Kitty Hawk's superior diving speed and rugged construction, striking with devastating precision, and then disengaging before the Germans could respond. They fought like dingoes hunting. Kangaroos, patient, strategic, always attacking from the position of advantage, never committing to a fair fight because, as Gibbies liked to say, fair fights are for idiots who want to die young. Over the following months, the pattern repeated with terrifying consistency. Every time the Luftwaffe encountered the distinctive markings of No. 450 Squadron, the yellow and blue kangaroo painted on each fuselage, they found themselves outmaneuvered, outfought, and outflown by pilots who shouldn't have been able to compete. The psychological impact began to mount. German pilots started reporting encounters with what they called Die Känguru Teufel, the kangaroo devils, describing them in terms usually reserved for supernatural phenomena. One Luftwaffe pilot, Hauptmann Klaus Werner, a veteran with 23 confirmed kills, survived an encounter with Gibbies' flight and wrote in his diary, "Today I met the Australians. I thought I was an ace, a skilled warrior of the air. I was wrong. I was prey, and they were predators. I saw my wingman, Friedrich, a man who had flown over France and Russia, reduced to panic, screaming into the radio as they carved through our formation like we were training students. I escaped only because they let me go, I am certain of it. They could have finished me, but they chose mercy. That somehow makes it worse. But the squadron's deadliest period was yet to come. In 1942, they were reassigned to the defense of Darwin, Australia, which had become a primary target for Japanese air raids. Here they faced a different enemy but employed the same ruthless efficiency. Japanese bombers and Zero fighters learned the same painful lesson the Luftwaffe had learned. The Australians didn't care about honor or glory in combat. They cared about destroying the enemy and going home alive. Their kill count climbed relentlessly. 30 aircraft, 50, 75. Each number represented not just a machine destroyed, but often an experienced enemy pilot. Dead, wounded, or permanently grounded with shattered nerves. Then came their return to the European theater in 1944, now equipped with more modern aircraft and carrying a reputation that preceded them like a shockwave. Luftwaffe squadrons began receiving intelligence briefings specifically about No. 450 Squadron, complete with recognition guides and tactical recommendations. The recommendations essentially boiled down to, avoid engagement if possible. This is where the antagonists of our story truly crystallize, because by 1944, the Luftwaffe High Command was facing an existential crisis. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Hitler's obese and increasingly desperate Air Force commander, was under enormous pressure. The strategic bombing campaign was destroying German industry. The Eastern Front was consuming men and machines at an unsustainable rate. And now, in the West, Allied air superiority was becoming absolute. Göring needed victories, needed propaganda, needed something to boost the IE morale of his pilots, who were increasingly aware that they were fighting a losing war. What he got instead were reports that a single Australian squadron had accumulated a kill-to-loss ratio of 15-1, that veteran German aces were refusing to engage them, that the mere sighting of their aircraft was causing formations to break off attacks and return to base. This was unacceptable. It was humiliating. It undermined everything the Nazi propaganda machine had built about Aryan superiority and the invincibility of German arms. Göring's response was predictable. Denial followed by rage. In a meeting with his commanders in March 1944, documented by multiple sources, he shouted, "These are colonials, criminals and sheep farmers. How can the master race, the pilots of the Luftwaffe, be bested by such inferiors? I will not accept these reports." His chief of staff, a practical man named General Lieutenant Werner Kreipe, responded with the kind of honesty that was becoming increasingly dangerous in Nazi Germany. "Herr Reichsmarschall, with respect, the evidence is overwhelming. No, 450 Squadron has destroyed over 140 confirmed aircraft. They've killed or captured at least 18 of our aces, including—" Silence! Göring's face had turned purple. But the problem couldn't be silenced, couldn't be intimidated away. The Australian success rate kept climbing, their tactics kept evolving, and German pilots kept dying. Younger Luftwaffe aviators, hastily trained, replacements for the veterans being ground down on all fronts, started to whisper that flying against the Australians was a death sentence, that you had a better chance of survival over Berlin in broad daylight than in a dogfight with the desert demons. These whispers eventually reached the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, in the summer of 1944. The Führer was already in a deteriorating mental state, the July assassination attempt having left him paranoid and erratic. When he learned that German pilots were actively avoiding combat with a specific enemy unit, his reaction was volcanic. Witnesses reported that he ranted for nearly 20 minutes about cowardice, about the decay of German fighting spirit, about the betrayal of the SS and Wehrmacht officers who surrounded him. But then, in a moment of terrible clarity, he stopped mid-sentence. The room fell silent. Hitler walked to the map table, stared at the markers representing Allied air forces, and then did something that shocked everyone present. He admitted a truth he had spent the entire war denying. "They're better than us," he said quietly, almost to himself. "These Australians, they're simply better than our pilots." The words hung in the air like a confession of sin. Göring started to protest, but Hitler raised his hand for silence. "I want a full report on this squadron. Everything. Their tactics, their commanders, their training methods. And I want recommendations for how to neutralize them." The report that landed on Hitler's desk 2 weeks later made for grim reading. It detailed how No. 450 Squadron had not only survived but thrived in every theater they'd fought in, how their pilots had an average of over 300 combat hours, how they developed innovations in formation flying and communication that the Luftwaffe was only beginning to understand. But more damning than the tactical analysis was the psychological assessment. The report's author, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer who would later defect to the Allies, wrote, "The Australian pilots possess a quality that cannot be trained or instilled through discipline. They fight without the burden of ideology or the paralysis of excessive military hierarchy. They trust each other completely. They adapt instantly to changing circumstances. and they view combat not as a test of national superiority, but as a problem to be solved efficiently. Our pilots are trained to follow orders and trust in German engineering superiority. When that trust is broken, when they encounter an enemy who negates our advantages, they have no psychological foundation to fall back upon. The Australians, by contrast, have built their approach on individual skill and collective improvisation. This makes them extraordinarily dangerous and, I must conclude, superior air combatants in the current operational environment. Hitler read this report multiple times, sources indicate, each time growing more agitated. Here was objective evidence that his racial theories were nonsense, that the inferior peoples from the colonies could outfight his supposedly superior Aryan warriors. But Hitler was also, beneath all his madness, a politician who understood optics and morale. He couldn't publicly acknowledge Australian superiority without undermining the entire ideological foundation of the Nazi state. So he did the only thing he could do. He issued what historians would later call the coward's order, though it would never be officially recorded in those terms. Through Göring, he instructed Luftwaffe commanders to avoid unnecessary engagements with No. 450 Squadron to preserve our valuable pilots and aircraft for more strategically significant operations. In practice, this meant, if you see the Australians, run. Don't fight them unless absolutely necessary. The message filtered down through the chain of command in various forms, some explicit, some euphemistic, but the meaning was always clear. When Bobby Gibbies learned of this order, months later through intelligence intercepts, his reaction was typically understated. He was sitting in the officers' mess at their base in Italy, reading the decrypt with several of his pilots around him. One of them, a young sergeant named Peter Taylor who had only recently joined the squadron, asked excitedly, "Sir, doesn't this mean we've won? If they're scared to fight us, we've beaten them, right?" Gibbies looked up from the paper, those pale blue eyes, showing something that might have been amusement or might have been sadness. "No, mate. It means they've acknowledged reality. There's a difference." He paused, choosing his words carefully as always. "We haven't won anything. War isn't won by making your enemy afraid. It's won by making your enemy stop fighting. And they're still fighting, just not with us. That means other squadrons, other pilots who might not have our experience, they're the ones who'll face the Luftwaffe now. We've just made ourselves irrelevant." The weight of this observation settled over the group. They had wanted recognition, validation of their extraordinary achievements. Instead, they'd been given the ultimate compliment wrapped in the ultimate frustration. They were too good to fight. But here's where our story takes its most profound turn, where the layers of revelation truly begin to unfold. Because the truth about No. 450 Squadron, the real secret of their success, wasn't what anyone, including Hitler, thought it was. Yes, they had superior tactics. Yes, they had extraordinary pilots. But the foundation of their effectiveness, the thing that made them truly unbeatable, was something far more fundamental and far more human. In late 1944, a war correspondent named Margaret Chen, one of the few journalists allowed to embed with combat squadrons, spent 3 weeks with No. 450 at their Italian airbase. She wrote a series of articles that were initially classified because they revealed too much about operational methods, but they were eventually published after the war, and they offer an unprecedented glimpse into the squadron's culture. Chen observed that the Australians did something that seemed trivial, but was actually revolutionary. They talked to each other. Not just operational briefings or tactical discussions, but real conversations. Pilots discussed their fears, their mistakes, their close calls. They analyzed every mission collectively, not to assign blame but to learn. There was no hierarchy of ego, no sacred cows. If a junior pilot spotted a flaw in a squadron leader's tactics, he was expected to speak up, and that criticism would be considered seriously. This was radically different from Luftwaffe culture, where rigid hierarchy and unquestioning obedience were fundamental values. German pilots might be technically skilled, but they were trapped in a system that punished independent thinking and stifled adaptation. The Australians had built something different. Almost accidentally, a learning organization that improved exponentially with each engagement. Chen wrote, "I watched Squadron Leader Gibbies conduct a debriefing after a mission where they'd shot down 8 German aircraft without loss. Instead of celebrating, Gibbies spent 40 minutes dissecting a moment where one of his pilots had taken an unnecessary risk. The pilot, a sergeant with barely 50 hours of combat time, defended his decision. Gibbies listened, considered, and then nodded. 'You're right,' he said. 'I was wrong. Your read of the situation was better than mine. Good job.' I was stunned. In what other military unit would a commanding officer admit error to a subordinate? But for these men, ego is a luxury they can't afford. Only truth matters, only what works. This humility, this rejection of false pride, was their superpower. It allowed them to learn from every mistake, to integrate lessons instantly, to become collectively smarter with each passing day. There's another layer to this story, one that adds even more complexity and emotional depth. Among the Luftwaffe pilots who survived encounters with No. 450 Squadron was a man named Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, an ace with 31 kills who had been shot down by Gibbies himself over Tunisia in 1943. Hartmann survived the crash but was captured by Australian ground forces and spent the remainder of the war in a POW camp in Australia. In a twist of fate that seems almost scripted by destiny, Hartmann was eventually transferred to a camp near Young, Gibbies' hometown. After the war, Hartmann made an extraordinary decision. He stayed in Australia, married a local woman, and became a farmer. In the 1960s, he tracked down Gibbies, who had returned to his farm and was living quietly, never speaking much about the war. Their first meeting was tense, two old warriors facing each other across a kitchen table in rural New South Wales. Hartmann spoke first, his English heavily accented but clear. "I came to ask you a question that has haunted me for 20 years. Why did you shoot me down?" Gibbies looked confused. "Because there was a war on, mate. That's what we did." "No," Hartmann insisted, leaning forward. "I have studied that engagement obsessively. You had me dead 3 times before you finally fired. You could have killed me easily. But you waited, you gave me chances to escape. Why?" The silence that followed was profound, stretching across decades of history and oceans of blood. Finally Gibbies spoke, and his words cut to the very heart of what made the desert demons different, what made them special. "Because you weren't the enemy, Friedrich. You were just a bloke flying for the other side. The enemy was the war itself, the stupidity and waste of it all. We shot you down because we had to, because that was our job, because if we didn't, you'd kill our mates or bomb our cities. But we didn't hate you. We never hated you. Hatred makes you sloppy, makes you take risks to satisfy emotion rather than to complete the mission. We stayed alive, we were effective, because we never forgot that you were a human being just like us, probably scared just like us, definitely wanting to go home just like us. The moment you start hating, the moment you start seeing the enemy as less than human, that's when you stop thinking clearly. That's when you make mistakes. That's when you die." Hartmann sat back, his eyes wet with tears. "In all my time in the Luftwaffe, no officer ever spoke to me like this, with this kind of wisdom. We were told we were the master race, that our enemies were subhuman, that Germany's victory was ordained by history and blood. This arrogance, this hatred, it blinded us. It made us predictable. And it made you unstoppable." This is the real revelation, the profound truth at the center of this story. The desert demons weren't successful because they were more aggressive or more brutal or more fanatical than their enemies. They were successful precisely because they rejected those qualities. They fought with cold professionalism born of respect, respect for their enemies' skills, respect for the deadly nature of combat, respect for the thin line between life and death at 20,000 feet. They won because they were humble enough to keep learning, confident enough to trust each other, and wise enough to understand that hatred is a handicap, not a strength. Hitler banned them from his airspace not because they were monsters, but because they were men, the best kind of men, who had mastered their craft through teamwork, adaptability, and an absolute refusal to let ego override effectiveness. The Nazi ideology had no answer to this, could not even comprehend it. How do you fight an enemy who has transcended the very premises your entire worldview is built upon? You can't. You can only run. The squadron's final tally, compiled after the war, was astonishing. 163 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, probably more than 200 if you count unconfirmed kills and ground destructions. They had produced 16 aces, pilots with 5 or more kills. But more impressive than any numbers was what they represented. Proof that excellence in warfare, like excellence in anything, comes not from believing in your own superiority, but from honestly assessing reality, learning from your mistakes, and working together toward a common goal without letting ego poison the well. In the decades after the war, military academies around the world studied No. 450 Squadron, trying to bottle their secret sauce to replicate their success. They analyzed their tactics, their aircraft, their training methods, but most missed the essential point, because it wasn't something you could teach in a classroom or write in a manual. It was a culture, an approach to life. forged in the harsh Australian landscape and tempered in the crucible of war. It was the understanding that the loudest person in the room is rarely the smartest, that rank doesn't equal wisdom, that a shepherd from the outback might see patterns in the sky that an aristocrat from Berlin never could. Bobby Gibbons lived until 2007, dying peacefully at the age of 90. He never bragged about his wartime service, never sought glory or recognition. When journalists occasionally asked him about being one of the greatest fighter pilots in history, about making Hitler himself fear his squadron, he would shrug with that characteristic Australian humility and say, "We just did our job, mate, nothing special about it." But there was something special about it, something extraordinary and profoundly important, not just for understanding that war, but for understanding human potential itself. The Desert Demons proved that excellence comes from collaboration, not competition, that wisdom often wears work clothes, speaks with an unfashionable accent, and doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfares, that the most dangerous warrior is not the one consumed by hate or ideology, but the one who approaches violence as a problem to be solved efficiently and dispassionately, who respects his enemy enough to never underestimate him, who values his teammates enough to listen to them regardless of rank. These were men who understood that true strength is inseparable from humility, that real courage includes admitting when you're wrong, and that the highest form of warrior discipline is knowing when to fight and when to show mercy. Today, number 450 Squadron still exists in the Royal Australian Air Force, flying modern aircraft but carrying the same traditions, the same ethos. New pilots joining the squadron learn the stories of Gibbies and his men, not as myths of superhuman heroes, but as examples of what ordinary people can achieve through extraordinary teamwork and humility. The kangaroo insignia still adorns their aircraft, a symbol not of aggressive nationalism, but of that hard-won wisdom. Stay alert, adapt quickly, work together, and never ever let arrogance cloud your judgment. In a world that often celebrates individual genius and encourages us to believe that confidence requires projecting superiority, the story of the Desert Demons offers a different model. They were confident, supremely so, but their confidence came from collective competence, from honest assessment of their strengths and weaknesses, from treating every engagement as a learning opportunity. They terrified the Aussie Luftwaffe not with cruelty or zealotry, but with relentless, humble excellence. And perhaps that's the most important lesson, the message that transcends the specific circumstances of World War II, and speaks to how we should approach any challenge in life. Whether you're building a business, raising a family, learning a craft, or fighting for a cause you believe in, the principles that made number 450 Squadron legendary remain relevant. Check your ego at the door and prioritize what works over what feels good. Listen to everyone, regardless of their position or background, because wisdom can come from anywhere. Treat your opponents with respect, never underestimate them, and recognize their humanity even as you compete against them. Build systems that encourage learning from failure rather than punishing it. Value collective success over individual glory. Stay adaptable because the world changes, and the tactics that worked yesterday might fail tomorrow. And above all, remember that true greatness whispers rather than shouts, that the deadliest force on any battlefield is disciplined competence married to humble wisdom. Hitler banned the Desert Demons from his airspace because they represented everything his ideology couldn't understand or defeat. Ordinary people achieving extraordinary things through collaboration, learning, and respect. That they did it while wearing the uniform of a nation that many dismissed as unsophisticated colonials makes the story all the sweeter, all the more powerful as a reminder that underestimating the quiet competence of humble people is one of history's most repeated mistakes. So if you found this story as powerful and inspiring as I did, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this message about what real strength looks like. Drop a comment telling me what lesson from the Desert Demons resonates most with you. And subscribe because there are so many more untold stories of extraordinary ordinary people who changed history without seeking fame or glory. The world needs these stories now more than ever. Reminders that excellence is built on humility, that strength includes gentleness, and that the greatest victories are won not by those who shout the loudest about their superiority, but by those who quietly do the work, learn from their mistakes, and lift each other up. The Desert Demons flew into legend not because they believed they were better than everyone else, but because they never stopped learning how to be better than they were yesterday. That's a philosophy worth remembering, worth living by, whether you're flying a fighter plane over the desert or just trying to navigate the challenges of everyday life. Thank you for watching. And remember, stay humble, stay hungry, and never stop learning.